This episode is brought to you by Netflix. So Netflix is basically Santa this year. 2 NFL games on Christmas Day, streaming live. At 1 p.m. Eastern, it's Cowboys, Commanders. Then at 4:30, you've got Lions, Vikings. Midwest football, playoff stakes, and probably some snow. Watching holiday football is a tradition the whole family can enjoy. Open some gifts, grab some food, settle in, and watch NFL Live on Netflix this Christmas Day.
This podcast is brought to you by Carvana. Carvana makes car selling fast and easy from start to finish. Enter your license plate or VIN and get a real offer in seconds, down to the penny. If you accept, Carvana will come pick up your car from your driveway. Or you can drop it off at one of our car vending machines. Either way, you get paid instantly. It's fast, transparent, and 100% online. Car selling that saves your time. That's Carvana.
Carvana.
Pickup fees may apply.
Hello, and welcome to a special bonus episode of Ben Franklin's World. The Omohundro Institute and I are happy to bring you this short bonus episode as a thank you for subscribing to this podcast. Having you along for our explorations of early American history each week is really and truly the reason for this show. Now, if you're listening to this episode via the web, I encourage you to go download the free Ben Franklin's World app so that you get all episodes of this podcast as soon as they're published. Plus, having the app ensures that you'll receive occasional unannounced bonus episodes like this listener Q&A with historian Doug Winiarski delivered directly to your smartphone or tablet. Now, you're going to hear more about the Great Awakening and religious life in early New England with Doug in episode 182, when we explore details from his book, Darkness Falls on the Land of Light, published by the producers of Ben Franklin's World, the Omohundro Institute, and their partners, the University of North Carolina Press. Now, Darkness Falls on the Land of Light is the story of how ordinary New Englanders, living through extraordinary times, ended up giving birth to today's evangelical movement. To write his book, Doug performed a really close reading of letters, diaries, and testimonies, and his outstanding scholarship in this book was just recognized with a 2018 Bancroft Prize. That's one of the highest honors in the world of history. Now, a number of you have asked me questions about early American religious views, and I thought, okay, I have Doug on the line for his interview, so why not take advantage of his expertise and have him answer your questions? So in today's bonus episode, you'll hear answers to your questions about the Halfway Covenant, the relationship between the Great Awakening and today's American Christianity, whether the Great Awakening fostered a greater sense of Americanness among British colonists, and what it would be like to live as an atheist in early New England. Listeners like yourself really drive this podcast and all the topics it covers. So please get in touch with your questions about early American history and the topics you'd like to explore. Send me an email, liz@benfranklinsworld.com. And now, let's have Doug answer your questions. Doug, Dan wonders if you would tell us about the Halfway Covenant and the social dynamics behind it. Specifically, he'd like to know what the Halfway Covenant was and how New Englanders' anxiety about church membership fed into the creation of the covenant and into the revivalism of the Great Awakening.
Okay, that's an interesting question. The Halfway Covenant is a well-known but difficult to understand practice that emerged in New England in the 1660s. Although it wasn't called that, it was called owning the covenant, or more recently, historians have called it extended baptism. So it's an intermediate kind of church membership level, in between being just a mere member of the congregation and being a full church member. What the Puritan ministers found by the 1660s, about a generation after they had come and set up shop in the New World, is that many parents were increasingly afraid to take the step of the test of relation to try to join the church in full church membership. And they were resistant to it. So they were holding back and holding back and holding back. And yet they desperately wanted to get their kids baptized. And yet they were afraid to participate in the other part of what being a full church member entailed, and that was receiving the Lord's Supper. They knew from certain words in the book of 1 Corinthians that if you participate in the Lord's Supper, if you consumed Christ's body and blood unworthily, you risked drinking and eating your own damnation. So many sort of emerging adults wanted baptism for their kids, but didn't want to participate in the Lord's Supper, so they're hanging back. And through a series of adjustments, ministers debated trying to create a new intermediate level of church membership where people could own the church covenant. They could affirm the basic principles that were spelled out in the church's written sort of governing documents and achieve a sort of middle level of affiliation where they could get their kids baptized, but not participate in the Lord's Supper. What's interesting about it for my project is that the phrase halfway covenant, which appears in scholarship on 17th century Puritanism and has been that way for more than half a century, is actually, the phrase itself is a Great Awakening innovation. As people began to withdraw from the churches of the Congregational Standing Order during the 1740s, as they began to say, my experience is no longer square with the church in which I've been born and raised, I want to join one of these strict or separate congregational churches, they were usually disciplined by their church for leaving, for withdrawing from communion. And they would oftentimes provide lists of reasons why they were leaving the congregational establishment. And one of those reasons is because the church admitted to membership this intermediate group of people, these covenant owners. And so the phrase halfway covenant was a way of deriding this more expansive understanding of church affiliation that took shape in the middle decades of the 17th century by much more radical and zealous evangelicals of the mid-18th century.
Leslie and Bob wonder if you would tell us if and how the Great Awakening and all the evangelicalism it inspired is tied to today's American Christianity.
Well, for one thing, I think contemporary evangelicals look back to the period of the Great Awakening as an important originary moment for their own movement. And many of them herald Jonathan Edwards as one of the sort of great progenitors of the evangelical movement, as well as George Whitefield. I actually think if we understand evangelicalism as a broader movement with a lot of sort of differences among different kinds of evangelicals, that we can actually see that that desire to break away from an establishment becomes a defining feature of evangelicalism today. So in the United States of today, you'll find evangelical churches that are mainstream denominations, that are individual churches, that are storefront churches, that meet in movie theaters and in shopping centers and schools, independent congregations, like that push to develop new forms of religious community based upon like-minded belief and experience is, I think, something that comes out of the Great Awakening and reverberates up through today. In many ways, I think that the Great Awakening is not an event, a 4-year event that happens, it starts with George Whitefield and ends with the New London bonfires, but is really more like, if we change a metaphor here, it's more like throwing a rock in a pond, and evangelicals are the ripples that continue to ripple out toward the edges of the lake ever since.
Tumek would like to know if the Great Awakening played a role in helping to foster a sense of Americanness across Great Britain's 13 North American colonies. And if it did foster a greater sense of Americanness, he'd like to know how it created this sense of identity.
People often ask me this question, and they ask it in a slightly different way, and that is, what's the relationship between the Great Awakening and the American Revolution? There's a famous article that was written by a Princeton professor many years ago called No Awakening, No Revolution. And more recently, other scholars have talked about the ways in which the awakening created what T.H. Breen has called this corrosive logic of choice, the idea that you could choose your religious belief, your practice, your denomination, your group. But I'm not sure that it bound the colonies together. The argument in favor of that position is that George Whitefield moved up and down the colonies, and the experience that he placed at the center of his movement is one that could be shared by people in South Carolina and in Maine. But for New Englanders in particular, the ways in which the Whitefield revivals break apart the established congregational churches means that it divided as much as it united those people. So I'm not sure it created a unified sense of identity. If anything, at least in New England, it diversified Christianity in ways that were unprecedented for New England's religious history in particular.
Okay, Beckett is an atheist, and she wonders if she would have been tolerated if she had lived in colonial New England, given the region's strong religious traditions.
In a word, no. Beckett should probably, if she were living in 18th century New England, have kept her free-thinking deist or atheist ideas private. This is a society that has blasphemy laws. So saying things, sharing your ideas and opinions, especially when they run in that direction, you could have wound up in front of the county courts on charges of blasphemy. So, this is not a world of tolerance, not yet. But in some ways, actually, I think that the growing sense of religious diversity, the different ways of experiencing religion that comes out of New England in the Great Awakening, comes before the enshrinement of ideals of religious liberty in our First Amendment. That is to say, I think the experience of diversity comes first, and then the idea of religious liberty or religious freedom that gets enshrined in the Constitution and Bill of Rights comes later as an attempt to try to create a society that can encompass the increasingly fractious and diverse marketplace of religion that emerges as a result of the revivals of the 1740s.
Now, don't forget to check out episode 182, where you can join Doug for a longer conversation about religion in 18th century New England, with details from his Bancroft Prize winning book, Darkness Falls on the Land of Light.
Are you interested in the parts of history that remain a mystery? Do you want to learn more about the historical myths and misconceptions used to prop up false belief today? I'm Nathaniel Lloyd. In my podcast, Historical Blindness, I delve into all of these topics, sharing puzzling tales from the past and examining hoaxes, conspiracy theories, and misremembered events that provide insight into modern politics and religion. New episodes every 2 weeks. Find Historical Blindness on most podcast players and platforms.